The dining room smelled like rosemary and something Evelyn used to make on Sunday evenings, a roast with garlic pressed into the fat, the kind that took 4 hours and made the whole house hold its breath. I recognized the smell before I recognized anything else. Then I saw my chair. It had been moved. Not far, maybe 6 feet down the table, away from the head, tucked between the buffet cabinet and the wall where the light from the chandelier didn't quite reach. The chair at the head of the table, the one with the slightly worn armrest on the left side, the one where I had sat for 31 years, had a place setting in front of it now, and a name card I didn't need to read to understand. I stood in the doorway for a moment. 20 people were still finding their seats, adjusting chairs, setting down drinks. Nobody noticed me standing there. I walked to the chair by the buffet and sat down. Serena was at the far end of the room near the kitchen pass-through, holding a glass of white wine and talking to her sister Carol with the particular animation of a woman who had been planning this evening for weeks. She had organized everything: the caterers, the centerpieces, the playlist coming softly from somewhere I couldn't see. She was good at this. I want to be accurate about that. She had a talent for hospitality that was real and not performed, and when she turned to greet the Andersons from Marcus's office, her smile arrived a half-second before she needed it to. That is a skill. I recognized it because I had spent 30 years reading blueprints and job sites, and in both cases, the difference between something built to last and something built to impress is usually invisible until it isn't. I counted the number of times she said "I chose" in the first 12 minutes. It was 7. I chose the caterer from a place in Millbrook. I chose these flowers because they last. I chose to keep the lighting low. It's warmer. 7 times in 12 minutes. In the house I built in 1989, on a lot my wife and I had driven past for 2 years before we could afford it. Evelyn had wanted the corner bedroom to face east. I had told her the load-bearing wall made it complicated. She had looked at me in the way she sometimes did, patient, certain, not asking again, and I had redesigned the eastern support structure over a weekend to make the bedroom face the way she wanted. There is a hairline crack in the lower left corner of the kitchen window frame, barely visible unless you know to look, where the settling shifted 3 years after we moved in. I had monitored it for 4 years before I was satisfied it wasn't moving. Evelyn had asked me once what I was looking at whenever I stood at that window. I told her I was looking at the yard. That was also true. She died in the back bedroom, the east-facing one, on a Tuesday in March, 11 years ago. The light came in at the angle she had wanted. I sat in my relocated chair and looked down the table. The chair where Evelyn used to sit, the one to the immediate right of the head, close enough that she could reach across and correct my napkin placement without getting up, had a centerpiece on it now, a low arrangement of white flowers in a glass vase. It had been moved there, I realized, to fill the gap created by pushing the seating configuration toward the opposite end. Nobody had planned to put flowers on Evelyn's chair. It had just worked out that way. I looked at the crack in the window frame. Still there. Still the same. Marcus appeared from the kitchen carrying 2 glasses and handed one to a man from his firm whose name I had learned twice and forgotten. My son is 41 years old and has his mother's eyes and my tendency to stand with his weight on his left foot when he's uncertain about something. He was standing that way now. He saw me across the room, and something moved across his face. Not guilt exactly. More like the expression of a man who had told himself a version of events that was becoming harder to maintain. He raised his glass slightly. I raised mine. He went back toward the kitchen. Serena had proposed the dinner 6 weeks ago. She had called me on a Sunday, which was itself unusual. She normally texted, and she had been warm and specific in the way that made it easy to say yes. She wanted to keep the tradition of family dinners at the house. She said the word tradition twice. She said she knew how much the house meant to Marcus and to me. She said she thought it would be good for everyone to gather somewhere that felt like home. I had listened to all of it, and I had said yes, because the reasons she gave were the right reasons. And at that point, I was still deciding whether what I suspected was something I had constructed or something I had observed. 3 weeks before that dinner, 9 weeks before this one, Arthur Finch had called me on a Wednesday afternoon. Arthur had been my attorney for 19 years. The kind of man who called only when there was a reason and never used more words than the reason required. He told me that someone had contacted his office asking general questions about property transfer procedures, specifically about the process by which a married couple could be added to or substituted onto a deed when the original owner was elderly and the property was a primary residence. The inquiry had been informal, no name given, no engagement started, but the caller had mentioned the address on Millbrook Road, my address, the house where I was currently sitting, in a chair that had been moved 6 feet down the table. Arthur said he thought I should know. I thanked him and told him I'd be in touch. I was in his office the following Friday with a folder I had been assembling for some time. We talked for 2 hours. I drove home on Millbrook Road the way I always did. Past the lot where the Osei family had lived for 14 years, Frank's truck was in the driveway, same as always, and I pulled into my garage and sat for a moment before going inside. I had not mentioned Arthur's call to Marcus. I had not mentioned it to Diane, my daughter, who would have reacted immediately and loudly and without the patience the situation required. I had not mentioned it to anyone. I had made a roast that Sunday and eaten it alone at the kitchen table and looked at the crack in the window frame and thought about load-bearing structures and the difference between a flaw that's moving and a flaw that has simply settled into what it is. Now I watched Serena lift her wine glass toward Carol, laughing at something. Carol laughed too. Carol was the more guarded of the two sisters, the one who watched before she spoke, and she was watching me now with an expression I couldn't fully read from this distance. I looked away. The caterer's assistant set a plate in front of me. The rosemary smell sharpened. 20 people found their chairs, and the room settled into the particular noise of a dinner party beginning silverware, voices overlapping, someone asking about parking. Serena moved to the head of the table and stood for a moment with her glass raised, and the room quieted. I picked up my fork. I cut the first piece of meat. It was a good roast. I noted that without pleasure or resentment, the way I would note a measurement that came in within tolerance, just accurate, just what it was. The dinner began. 6 months before that dinner, Marcus called me on a Tuesday evening while I was in the garage replacing a section of weather stripping on the side door. I remember the specific task because I had been meaning to do it for 3 weeks and had finally gotten around to it, and the call interrupted me halfway through. I set down the utility knife and answered. He said Serena had mentioned something at a gathering the previous weekend, a birthday party for one of her colleagues, people I didn't know. She had introduced the house to someone, apparently referred to it as our house. Marcus said it quickly, the way he said things he suspected I might not like. He added before I could respond that she just wanted to feel welcomed, that she was trying to put down roots, that it was a figure of speech. Really? I told him I understood. I hung up and finished the weather stripping. Then I went inside, washed my hands at the kitchen sink, and sat down at the table where Evelyn and I had eaten breakfast for 23 years. I opened the small notebook I kept in the drawer beside the refrigerator, the one I'd used since my engineering days for site observations, measurements, anything worth recording, and I wrote the date, and what Marcus had told me, and the phrase he'd used, "She just wants to feel welcomed." I closed the notebook and put it back in the drawer. I didn't mention it to anyone. There was nothing to mention yet. An engineer doesn't call a structural failure the first time he notices a hairline crack. He documents it. He watches it. He waits to see if it moves. 3 months later, on a Saturday afternoon in early October, Serena sat down across from me at that same kitchen table with a manila folder and what I recognized as the expression of someone who has rehearsed what they're about to say. She had a document inside the folder, 2 pages, single-spaced. She slid it toward me and explained that she and Marcus had been thinking about practical matters, about the future. She said the word future the way people say it when they mean something specific, but want it to sound general. The document was a request to add Marcus's name to the deed. She walked me through her reasoning carefully, and I'll say this for Serena, she was good at reasoning. She said that if anything happened to me, Marcus would have no legal standing to manage the property without going through probate. She said it could take months, cost thousands. She said she wasn't suggesting any change to my ownership, just a joint tenancy arrangement. She said she'd already spoken to someone who knew about these things, and it was a simple process. Really. I read the document twice. Then I set it on the table between us and told her I would ask my attorney before signing anything. She said, of course. She said she completely understood. She said there was no rush at all. She left an hour later, and I watched her car back out of the driveway from the kitchen window. I noticed she didn't wave. She usually waved. I called Arthur Finch the following Monday. Arthur had handled the estate when Evelyn died, and before that, he'd reviewed the original purchase contract when we bought the property in 1989. He was 71 years old, semi-retired, and the kind of attorney who returned calls the same day. I told him what Serena had proposed. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he'd like to see the document she'd given me. I drove it to his office that afternoon. He called back 2 days later. He said the document itself was standard, but the framing concerned him. Joint tenancy with right of survivorship, he explained, meant that if I died, Marcus would inherit automatically, but it also meant that Marcus, as a joint tenant, would have the right to petition for partition if there was ever a dispute. He said the document Serena had brought me was not written by someone who knew about these things casually. It had been drafted by a real estate attorney. He asked if I knew which one. I didn't. I told Arthur to hold on to the document and to note the name of the firm listed in the footer. He said he already had. After that, Serena was pleasant to me in the way that people are pleasant when they're waiting. She answered my questions at Sunday dinners with complete sentences and asked about my health with what looked like genuine concern. But she stopped coming by the house on her own. She stopped suggesting things directly to me. Whatever she wanted to say, she said to Marcus first, and Marcus would relay it later with the particular tone of a man trying to translate between two languages he only partly understood. 6 weeks before the dinner, Frank Ossie knocked on my door on a Thursday morning. Frank had lived next door for 16 years. His wife, Gloria, had been in Evelyn's book club. He was a careful man, the kind who noticed things and said so without making a production of it. He told me he'd seen Serena at the house 2 weekends prior while I was visiting Diane in Columbus. She'd been there with a man he didn't recognize, walking the perimeter of the property. They'd spent time in the backyard. He said the man had taken photographs, the exterior, the lot line, the detached garage. I asked Frank if he'd caught any detail about the man. He said the man had driven a dark green Subaru Outback, newer model, with a magnetic sign on the door. He'd been too far away to read the sign clearly, but he thought it said something with realty in it. I thanked Frank and told him I appreciated him letting me know. After he left, I stood at the kitchen window for a while. The apple tree Evelyn had planted the spring Marcus was born was still holding a few late-season leaves, pale yellow, moving slightly in the wind. I thought about a conversation I'd had with her once, maybe 15 years ago, sitting on the back porch after a difficult week at work. She'd said something I'd written down later because I wanted to keep it. The difference between a problem and a situation is whether you've decided to do something about it. I went to the garage and found the registration Serena's family had sent the previous Christmas, a group photo, everyone named on the back in her mother's handwriting. I found the name I was looking for, her cousin, Daniel Voss. I looked him up. He had a license with the state, a website, and a headshot. In the headshot, he was standing in front of a dark green Subaru Outback. I called Arthur that afternoon. I told him I wanted printed copies of the original deed from 1989 and the current certificate of title. I told him I wanted them in my hands, not in a file somewhere, not in a drawer at his office. Arthur said, "Raymond, what are you planning?" I told him I didn't know yet, but I wanted the documents where I could reach them. He said he'd have them ready by end of week. He also said, and I noted that he said this without being asked, that he'd been reviewing the joint tenancy proposal again, and that there was a second document referenced in the footer that hadn't been included in what Serena gave me. He had requested a copy through his own channels. He was waiting for it to come back. I told him to let me know when it did. I picked up the documents on a Friday afternoon. Patricia Wren, Arthur's notary, handed me the envelope at the front desk. She had been at that office for 27 years. She looked at me over her reading glasses and said, "Everything's certified. Copies are exact." I thanked her and put the envelope in the inside pocket of my jacket. I drove home on Route 9 the long way, the way I'd driven since the boys at the highway department had repaved it in 2003, and it had been the smoothest road in the county ever since. I passed the turnoff where the old grain elevator used to stand before they demolished it. I passed the reservoir. I passed the sign for the subdivision where Marcus and Serena lived now, in a house I had helped them finance 3 years ago. When I got home, I put the envelope in the filing cabinet in the study second drawer, behind the folder labeled Insurance Vehicle. Not hidden, just placed where I knew exactly where it was. That night, Diane called. She'd received a printed invitation in the mail ivory cardstock, a small floral border for a dinner at my address in 6 weeks. It was signed The Holt Family. She asked if I had approved the wording. I told her I had known about the dinner for a week. Frank had mentioned it after seeing Serena's car in the driveway on a Tuesday morning when I was at my doctor's appointment. Diane was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Dad, what's going on?" I told her to come to the dinner. I told her to sit near me if she could manage it without making it obvious. She said she would. I said goodnight and hung up. I sat in the study for a while with the filing cabinet drawer half open, not looking at anything in particular. The house was quiet. The furnace clicked on and ran for a few minutes and then stopped. Outside, the apple tree stood in the dark, bare now, just the shape of it against the neighbor's porch light. I closed the drawer. I went to bed. The evening started the way Serena intended all her evenings to start, with everything in its place. She had rearranged the dining room furniture. The long table that Evelyn and I had bought at an estate sale in 1994, the one with the slight warp on the left leaf that I'd always meant to fix and never did, had been pushed against the wall and replaced with a rented table longer, wider, with fold-out legs. There were 20 chairs around it, all matching, all rented. The centerpieces were 3 low arrangements of white flowers I didn't recognize. The kitchen smelled like something catered, not cooked. I had arrived 20 minutes before the guests, as I always did at this house. Diane was already there, standing near the kitchen doorway, holding a glass of sparkling water she hadn't drunk. She looked at me when I came in. I gave her a small nod. She nodded back. Serena was in the kitchen directing 2 young women I hadn't seen before hired help, I assumed. She came out when she heard the door, smiled at me with the particular warmth she reserved for public appearances, and said, "Raymond, so glad you could make it." As if I'd driven 40 minutes to a house I'd owned for 31 years on her invitation. I said, "Serena, the flowers are nice." She said, "Thank you. I spent a lot of time on this." I believed her. That was the honest answer. The guests arrived in the next half hour. I knew some of them, Frank Osei from next door, who came with his wife Adise, 2 couples from Marcus's firm, Serena's sister Carol and her husband, whose name I could never remember. The rest were Serena's friends, mostly people I'd met once or twice at events where I'd been introduced as Marcus's dad and then not spoken to again. 20 people total, seated at the long white table, with Serena at one end and Marcus at the other. I was seated near the middle, between Frank and one of the firm couples. Diane had managed to take the chair to my left. She'd done it casually, arriving just before the seating settled, setting her bag on the chair as if she'd claimed it earlier. I noticed. I said nothing. The food came out in courses. Serena moved around the table between servings, refilling glasses, touching shoulders, laughing at things people said. She was good at this. I'd watched her do it for 3 years, and I still found myself noting how good she was at it, the right amount of attention to each person, the right amount of warmth, the right amount of deference to Marcus when he spoke. It was a performance, but it was a skilled one. I counted the ceiling tiles while she talked. There were 16. I'd never counted them before. The main course came. Roasted chicken, something with root vegetables, a bread basket passed around. The conversation was easy. The kind that happens at tables where no one knows each other well enough to say anything real. Someone mentioned a renovation project. Someone mentioned a school district. Frank Osei was talking to the firm couple about a property dispute on our street, something I already knew about. I was listening to Frank when I reached for the breadbasket. It had been passed around once already and had come back to the middle of the table, near the centerpiece. I reached across not far, just past my own place setting, and took a roll. Serena's voice came from 3 seats down, clear and carrying, pitched at exactly the volume that ensured the whole table would hear without her having to raise it. "Raymond, please don't take more. You didn't pay for this dinner. If you've ever stood beside someone who's been holding something in for a long time, you'll understand what I mean when I say the table heard it differently than she intended. I know, because I watched their faces." Carol laughed a short, reflexive sound, like she'd been waiting for it. 2 of Serena's friends looked down at their plates. The firm couple looked at each other. Adais Osei's hand stopped moving. Frank set his knife and fork down on the rim of his plate, very deliberately, and did not pick them up again. Diane opened her mouth. Serena continued before she could speak, the same voice, the same pleasant explanatory tone, as if she were clarifying a small misunderstanding for the benefit of the group. "I organized this dinner. I paid for it. I think it's fair for people to know who actually takes care of this family. 20 people heard it. I know because I counted them too." One of Serena's friends, a woman in a green blouse who had introduced herself to me earlier as someone from Serena's yoga class, nodded slowly, almost to herself, as if the explanation had clarified something she had been quietly wondering about. The firm couple looked at each other again, and this time neither of them looked back at me. I was in that moment simply a problem that had been named and categorized and could now be set aside. If you've ever been a father in a room full of people who are waiting to see what you do next, you'll understand something about the weight of the next 5 seconds. And if you've ever felt that weight, you might want to leave a like, because this moment is for every father who's ever sat at that kind of table. I put my hand flat on the table. Not a fist, not a gesture. Just my hand, open, on the tablecloth, the way I used to set it on a blueprint when I wanted a room full of engineers to stop talking and look. I looked at Serena. Not with anger. I want to be precise about that, because anger would have been the wrong thing, and I'd known it for months. What I felt in that moment was something closer to the particular calm that comes when a long calculation finally resolves when the numbers stop being abstract and become something you can hold. I looked at her the way I used to look at a site report when the numbers confirmed what I'd already suspected, the look of a man who has been waiting for a specific thing to happen and has just watched it happen. I said, "Thank you for making that clear." Then I picked up the roll. I put it on my bread plate. I picked up my fork and continued eating. The silence lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Then someone at the far end of the table said something to the person next to them, something small, about the chicken, and the surface of the dinner resumed. But the surface was different now. You could feel it the way you feel a change in air pressure before weather comes in. Frank Osei looked at me. Then he looked at Serena. Then he looked back at me. He picked up his fork, but he didn't eat. He held it for a moment, looking at his plate, and I could see him deciding something. He set it back down again. Diane took a slow sip of water. Her hand was steady. I noticed that too. Marcus was looking at his wine glass. He had been looking at it since before Serena spoke. He didn't look up when she finished. He didn't look up when I answered. The glass was nearly full. He'd barely touched it, and he was looking at it the way a man looks at something he's using to avoid looking at everything else. I finished my meal. I ate everything on my plate. The chicken was good. Actually, whoever had catered it had done a decent job with the seasoning. I had a second glass of water. I listened to Frank's conversation with the firm couple resume, haltingly at first, and then with more ease, the way conversations do when people are trying to pretend they didn't hear something they clearly heard. Serena circulated again after the main course, back to her role as the evening's architect. She didn't look at me directly for the rest of the meal. Carol looked at me once, from across the table. I couldn't read her expression clearly. something between satisfaction and something else, something less comfortable. I didn't hold her gaze long enough to determine which one was winning. When dessert was set out, a tart of some kind, store-bought from the look of it, I folded my napkin, set it beside my plate, and pushed my chair back quietly. I said goodnight to Frank in a daze. Frank stood and shook my hand. He held it a moment longer than usual and didn't say anything. I appreciated that. I said goodnight to Diane, who looked at me with the expression she'd had since she was 9 years old whenever she wanted to ask a question and knew it wasn't the time. I finished my meal before anyone else at the table. I did it deliberately, working through each course at the same pace I had maintained since the soup. There was lamb, overcooked, but I ate it. There were roasted carrots that Evelyn would have seasoned differently. I ate those too. I drank my water. I set down my fork on the right side of the plate, the way Evelyn had taught me in 1991, the year we hosted our first real dinner party in this house. The year she told me that how a man leaves a table says more about him than how he arrives at it. I picked up my cloth napkin, the ivory ones she'd bought at an estate sale in Concord, the ones Serena had tried to replace with paper last Thanksgiving, and that I had quietly retrieved from the linen closet, and I folded it along its original crease. Then I laid it beside my plate. I stood up. The conversation around the table had not fully recovered from what had happened 20 minutes earlier. There were smaller pockets of it now, Carol talking to the couple on her left, two of Marcus's colleagues discussing something about a project deadline. Serena was at the far end, refilling a glass, her back half turned. Marcus was looking at his plate. I said, "The dinner was very good. Enjoy the rest of your evening." I said it to the table, not to Serena specifically, not to Marcus, to the table. Diane stood up immediately. Her chair scraped back, and she was already reaching for her bag. I crossed to her before she'd taken a step. I put my hand on her shoulder lightly, the way I used to when she was small and upset about something she couldn't articulate yet, and I said, quietly enough that only she could hear, "Stay. I'm all right." She looked at me. Her eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with the candlelight. "Dad, stay with your brother," I said. "I mean it." She sat back down. I didn't watch her face after that. I found my coat on the rack by the door, the same rack Evelyn had installed in 1991, the one Serena had tried to replace twice, and that I'd quietly had reattached both times. I put it on. I let myself out. The porch light was on. The air outside was cold and still. I stood on the front step for a moment. Through the tall window to the left of the door, I could see the dining room. Serena had moved to the head of the table, Evelyn's chair, the one with the slightly higher back, and she was laughing at something, one hand on the shoulder of the man beside her, the other holding a glass of red wine. She stood the way Evelyn used to stand at gatherings, easy, unhurried, like the house had always been hers, like it had never been anyone else's. I watched her for a moment. Then I reached into the inside pocket of my vest. The folder was still there. 12 pages printed on a Thursday morning 3 weeks ago, reviewed twice, signed where Arthur had indicated, and carried since then in the same pocket every time I came to this house. Arthur had suggested I leave it with him. I'd told him I preferred to have it close. He hadn't argued. Arthur had known me long enough to understand that I do not carry things I don't intend to use. I took out my phone and called him. He picked up on the second ring. "Raymond." "Arthur," I said, "I need you here. Bring the file, the full one, not just the summary." A pause, not hesitation. Arthur doesn't hesitate. It was the pause of a man recalibrating his evening. "Tonight," he said. "How long would it take you?" 20 minutes, maybe less. I'm still at the office." "Then I'll be here," I said. I hung up and sat down on the front step. The stone was cold through my coat. I didn't mind. I had sat on this step more times than I could count the morning after we closed on the house in 1989, when Evelyn and I had eaten sandwiches on the porch because there was no furniture yet, and we hadn't cared. The evening Marcus came home from his first year of college, and we'd sat out here for 2 hours talking about nothing in particular. The night after Evelyn's funeral, when I had come outside at 2 in the morning because the house felt too full of people who meant well and I needed to breathe. This step had held a great deal over 35 years. It could hold a little more. Through the window, the dinner party continued. Someone had put on music low, ambient, the kind Serena favored. She was still standing at the head of the table, still laughing. Marcus had turned in his chair and was speaking to someone I didn't recognize, his posture careful, his hands flat on the table, the way they get when he is managing something internally and doesn't want it to show. He learned that from me. I wasn't sure whether to feel proud of it or not. Diane was still seated where I'd left her. She was not talking to anyone. She was looking at her water glass. I looked up at the oak tree at the edge of the driveway, the one Evelyn and I had planted the spring after we moved in. When it was barely taller than my knee, it was 40 feet now, maybe more. The lower branches had grown wide enough that they shaded the entire left side of the front walk in summer. Evelyn used to say it would outlast the house. I thought she was probably right. Headlights appeared at the end of the driveway, a dark sedan, moving carefully over the gravel. Arthur parked behind my car, stepped out, and came toward me carrying a leather briefcase. I recognized the same one he'd had for at least 15 years, the brass clasp worn smooth on one side. He stopped at the base of the steps and looked at me. He did not ask how I was. He did not comment on the fact that I was sitting on a stone step in the cold. He said, "You have the pocket copy." "Yes," I said. "Good." He set the briefcase on the step beside me and opened the clasp. "Then we're ready." I stood up. I brushed off my coat. Inside, through the window, Serena was still laughing. "We are," I said. Arthur walked in ahead of me. I held the door. The room was warm and loud and smelled like the lamb roast Diane had spent the better part of the afternoon preparing. 20 people, maybe a few more, distributed across the dining table and the sitting area beyond it. Someone had refilled the wine. The conversation had recovered from whatever silence I'd left behind when I walked out. People had a way of filling gaps quickly, especially when they were uncomfortable. I noticed that. Arthur stopped just inside the doorway. He was 63 years old, had been practicing family and property law for 37 of those years, and had the particular stillness of a man who had delivered difficult news in comfortable rooms so many times that the contrast no longer registered. He held his briefcase in his right hand. He looked around the room once, then at me. Serena was the first to see him. I watched her face from across the room the exact moment her eyes landed on Arthur and stayed there. Something shifted. Not dramatically. A small tightening around the jaw. A stillness where there had been animation. She had been mid-sentence, speaking to Carol about something I hadn't caught. She did not finish the sentence. Carol looked up, following her sister's gaze. Marcus was talking to Frank Osei near the fireplace. He hadn't noticed yet. I walked to the head of the table. The room did not go quiet all at once. It quieted the way rooms do when something changes in the atmosphere, before anyone can name what it is. A few conversations continued, most slowed. "I want to introduce someone," I said. My voice was level. I did not raise it. The room finished quieting on its own. "This is Arthur Finch. He's been the Holt family attorney for 22 years. He has some documents I'd like everyone to see." There was a pause. Then Serena said, "This isn't the appropriate time." Her voice was composed, reasonable, even. She looked around the table with the practiced expression of someone managing an awkward situation on behalf of others. "Raymond, we have guests. Whatever this is, it can wait." "I think this is exactly the right time," I said. She held my gaze for a moment. Then she looked at Arthur. Arthur looked back at her with the same expression he'd had since he walked in, courteous, patient, entirely unmoved. He set his briefcase on the side table near the window, opened it, and removed a manila envelope, thick with documents. He carried it to the dining table and placed it on the surface in front of Serena's seat. He did not hand it to her. He set it down and stepped back. "Mrs. Holt," Arthur said. "I'll keep this straightforward." He had the kind of voice that made people stop what they were doing, not loud, but precise, every word placed deliberately. The property at 14 Aldermore Lane, this house, where we are all currently sitting, is registered under the names Raymond Holt and Evelyn Holt. Evelyn Holt passed in 2019, per the terms of the original deed and the estate documentation filed at that time. Full ownership transferred to Raymond Holt. There are no co-owners. There are no additional names on the title. He opened the envelope himself and laid the first document flat on the table. The deed. Anyone close enough could see the header. The property description. The two names, Raymond Holt and Evelyn Holt, and the notarized stamp at the bottom. Frank Ossie had moved from the fireplace. He was standing at the edge of the dining area now, close enough to see the document. He looked at it. Then he looked at Serena. He didn't say anything. He had known me for 16 years. He had known Evelyn. He understood what he was looking at. Carol set her wineglass down on the side table. The small sound it made was the loudest thing in the room for a moment. Arthur placed a second document beside the first, a printed email chain. "This is a copy of a correspondence received by my office 3 months ago," he said. "An inquiry submitted under the name C. Holt, requesting information about the process for transferring residential property ownership, specifically the requirements for removing an existing owner's name from a deed and adding a new one." Serena said, "That's not what that was. I was asking a general question. I was trying to understand the process in case Raymond ever wanted to, Mrs. Holt." Arthur's voice did not change in volume or tone. The inquiry referenced this property by address. It asked specifically about the timeline for completing a transfer without the primary owner's active participation. He paused. "That is not a general question." The room was very quiet. Marcus had turned from the fireplace. He was standing still, holding his glass, not drinking from it. His face had the expression of a man who had just heard something in a language he thought he knew and found he didn't understand it the way he thought he did. "This is a misunderstanding," Serena said. Her voice had not broken. I gave her that she was composed in a way that took real effort. "Raymond, I think you've been given incomplete information, and I understand why you might be—" A woman's voice came from the doorway to the front hall, quiet, unhurried. "There is no misunderstanding here. Mrs. Holt!" Patricia Wren had been waiting in the hall. She was 61, had been a certified notary for 34 years, and had notarized Evelyn's will, the original deed amendment, and every property document the Holt family had filed since 1997. She walked in carrying a slim folder and stood beside Arthur. She opened the folder and held it so the table could see. "I have reviewed every document associated with this property filed in the last 4 years," she said. "There is no signature from Raymond Holt authorizing any transfer of ownership, no amendment, no preliminary agreement, nothing." She looked at Serena directly. "No transfer has been approved. None was ever initiated through proper channels." Serena looked at Carol. Carol looked at the table. Diane, who had been standing in the kitchen doorway for the last several minutes, was watching Marcus. I could see her from where I stood. She was not watching Serena. She was watching her brother, and her face held the careful stillness of someone who had been waiting a long time for a particular thing to become visible and was not sure how to feel now that it was. Marcus set his glass down on the mantel. He did it slowly, like a man making sure his hands were steady. I did not speak. I had said what I needed to say when I introduced Arthur. The documents had said the rest. I stood at the head of the table and watched the room, the way I had learned to watch rooms over 40 years of reading surveys and load-bearing plans, looking not at the surface but at what the surface was resting on, and whether it would hold. It was Frank who finally broke the silence, not with a speech, not with an accusation. He simply looked at me across the length of the table and said, "Ray, just that. My name. The way a man says a word when he wants you to know he understands the full weight of what just happened." I nodded once. Arthur closed his briefcase. Patricia returned her folder to the crook of her arm. The document stayed on the table, the deed with Evelyn's name still on it, and the email, and the clean, unambiguous record of everything that had not been signed. Frank stood up slowly. He was 67 years old and had lived next door to me for 23 years. And he moved the way a man moves when he has decided to say something he has been holding back for a while. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and took out his phone. He didn't make a speech about it. He just set the phone flat on the table and slid it toward the center so that everyone seated could see the screen. The photograph was clear. A man in a gray jacket standing at the end of my driveway, holding a clipboard, looking up at the roofline. The timestamp in the corner read 2 days ago, 7:14 in the evening. Frank said, "I know this man. His name is Dale Pruitt. He works for Bright Key Realty. They have an office on Carver Street, about 6 blocks from the county assessor's office." He paused. "I was walking my dog when I saw him. I asked him what he was doing. He said he was surveying the property at the request of a client. He said it was a preliminary walk-around." Frank looked down the table at Serena. His voice didn't change. I asked him who the client was. He said he wasn't at liberty to say, but he left a card. Frank picked up his phone, swiped once, and held up the next image, a business card, photographed flat on a surface. Bright Key Realty. Dale Pruitt, Senior Associate. And below that, in smaller text, a handwritten notation, Holt Conference, November 4th. Frank set the phone down again. He looked at Serena and said, "Who hired him?" "Serena." The room held that question for 3 seconds. I counted them. I have a habit of counting things when I need to stay still. Serena said, "Marcus and I only wanted to understand the property's market value for future planning." Her voice was even. She had practiced that voice, or something in her had learned it over years, the tone of a person explaining something obvious to someone being unreasonable. It's a significant asset. It makes sense to know what it's worth. I didn't speak. I picked up my water glass and held it. Marcus was sitting 2 seats to my left. He had been quiet for most of the evening, the kind of quiet that isn't peace but containment. A man holding something in because he hasn't yet decided what to do with it. But now he turned and looked at his wife. Not a glance. He looked at her the way I used to look at load-bearing calculations when something in the numbers didn't match the structure I was standing in, slowly, checking each line. He said, "I didn't know about this." Serena turned toward him. "Marcus." "I didn't know about this." "Serena." His voice was flat, not loud. Flat in the way a surface goes flat when all the tension has left it at once. "I didn't know you'd contacted anyone. I didn't know there was a walk-around. I didn't know there was a card with our name on it. You knew we talked about nothing like this." He said it quietly. And then he stopped talking, and the silence after it was different from the silences before it had a shape to it. The shape of something that had just been set down and couldn't be picked back up. Carol Pemberton had been sitting at the far end of the table near the window. She was Serena's older sister by 4 years, and she had arrived that evening with the practiced neutrality of a woman who has learned to stay out of her family's arguments. She had barely spoken all night, but now she placed both hands flat on the table, not aggressive, just present, and said, "Serena." Her voice was low. Serena looked at her. "You told me Raymond had already agreed." Carol said, "You told me before I came tonight. You said he had already signed off on the process, that it was just preliminary research, and that he was on board." She paused. "That's why I didn't ask questions. That's why I thought this was—" She stopped. She looked at me briefly, then back at her sister. "You said he already signed." "Carol, don't do this right now." "I'm not doing anything." Carol said, "I'm telling you what you told me, and it doesn't match what's on that table." She nodded toward the documents Arthur had left the deed with Evelyn's name, the email, the record of what had never been transferred and never been authorized. She pulled her hands back from the table and sat back in her chair. She didn't say anything else. It was Diane who spoke next. She had been sitting across from me, and she had not spoken once during the entire evening, not when Serena made her comments before dinner, not when the documents came out, not when Arthur laid the email flat for everyone to read. She had sat with her hands in her lap and her face very still, the way she used to sit as a child when she was processing something she didn't yet have words for. Evelyn used to call it Diane's thinking face. She said it meant the words, when they came, would be worth waiting for. Diane looked at Serena. She didn't raise her voice. She said, "My father built this house. He and my mother broke ground in 1989. I was 7 years old. I remember the framing going up. He took me to the site on a Saturday and let me write my name on one of the beams before they closed the wall. My mother chose the kitchen tile herself. She repainted the back bedroom 4 times before she was satisfied with the color." She stopped for a moment. "My mother died in that room 6 years ago. My father has lived here alone since then, and he has maintained this house, and paid every bill, and kept every light on, and he has never once asked anyone for recognition for any of it." She looked at Serena steadily. "He paid for nothing here. That's what you said. He paid for nothing." She let the words sit. "He paid with this house every single day. He paid with 35 years of his life and my mother's life. He paid with the room at the end of the hall." She didn't say anything more. She looked down at her hands. No one at the table responded to that. Marcus stood up. He didn't say anything to Serena. He didn't say anything to me. He pushed his chair back carefully the way you push a chair back when you want to leave without making noise, and walked out of the dining room into the hallway. I heard his footsteps go past the kitchen, past the coat closet, and stop somewhere near the front of the house. Then silence. I watched him go. I didn't stand. I didn't call after him. I thought about the last time I had watched my son leave a room without knowing what he was walking toward, and I thought about how many times a parent watches that happen and learns, eventually, that you cannot follow every time. Sometimes the most useful thing is to remain where you are and let the person find their own way back. I lifted my water glass and drank the last of it. The ice had melted. The water tasted faintly of the lemon slice that had been in it since the beginning of the meal, when the evening had still looked like one thing and had not yet become another. Frank sat back down. He picked up his phone and turned the screen off and put it back in his pocket. He didn't look satisfied. Frank was not the kind of man who looked satisfied when something went wrong in a room he cared about. He looked the way a person looks when they have done what was necessary and find no comfort in the necessity of it. Serena was still at the table. Her posture had not collapsed. She was still upright, still composed in the way that had always reminded me of a structure built to resist lateral force. But there was something different in her face now, some calculation running that was no longer about persuasion. It was about assessment. She was measuring what was left and what was gone. And I recognized that process because I had spent 40 years doing it, with buildings standing in a space after something had failed and asking what is still standing, and will it hold? I set my water glass down on the table. I did not answer her. I looked at the deed in the center of the table, Evelyn's name in the signature line, the date from 1989, the property description I had read so many times I could recite it from memory. The house at the corner of Aldermore Road and Sycamore, the lot dimensions, the legal description that had not changed in 35 years. Arthur was still in the room. Patricia had stepped back toward the doorway. Neither of them spoke. I picked up the deed. Arthur reached into the envelope one more time. He did it without announcement, no clearing of his throat, no pause to signal what was coming. He simply withdrew a single printed page and placed it on the table beside the deed. "This arrived at my office 3 weeks ago," he said. "Forwarded from Meridian Property Management. They contacted me to confirm the request before processing it." It was an email. Serena's name was in the sender field. The subject line read, "Contact Record Update, Aldermore Road Property." The body of it was brief. I read it from where I was sitting. The language was administrative, careful, the kind of phrasing someone uses when they want a thing to sound routine. It requested that the management company update their primary contact records for the property, remove Raymond Holt from the primary contact, replace with Marcus Holt and Serena Holt as co-primary holders. The stated reason, in the third line, was that the current primary contact was elderly and no longer participates in property decisions. Elderly. That was the word she had chosen. Arthur set the page directly in front of Serena. "I decline to authorize the change on Mr. Holt's behalf," he said. "I also notified Meridian that the request had no legal standing." He said both sentences the same way he might read a weather report. Then he folded his hands and waited. Marcus had been standing at the edge of the dining area since Arthur placed the email on the table. He had not moved. Now he walked forward, slowly, and picked up the page. He read it once. He read it again. I watched his eyes stop at the third line and stay there. He read it aloud. "The current primary contact is elderly and no longer participates in property decisions." He set the page down on the table. He looked at his wife. The room was completely still. "Did you write this?" he said. Serena opened her mouth. She closed it. She looked at Carol. Carol looked at the table. Marcus said it again, quietly. "Serena, did you write this?" She said, "Marcus, I can explain." "I'm not asking for an explanation," he said. "I'm asking if you wrote it." She did not answer. That was its own answer, and everyone at the table understood it. No one at the table spoke. I looked at Frank Osei. He was looking down at his own hands, both of them flat on the tablecloth. He had known me since Evelyn was alive. He had helped me carry her hospital bed down the stairs the week she came home for the last time. He did not look up. I stood. It was the first time I had risen from my chair all evening. I picked up the deed, the original, not a copy. The one with Evelyn's signature on the third line and the notary stamp from 1989 that had gone slightly pale over the years, but was still legible. I walked to the far end of the table. That end had always been Evelyn's seat. Serena was sitting in it now. I placed the deed on the table in front of her. He placed the deed on the table and said nothing. I did not say anything. I stood there for a moment long enough for her to read the top line, long enough for the room to understand what it was, and then I walked back to my chair and sat down. I picked up my water glass. I finished what was left in it. The guests left in stages. That is how it always goes after something like that. No one announces they are leaving. They simply begin to collect their things, to say quieter goodbyes, to find their coats. By 9:30, the dining room was empty except for the dishes and the 2 candles that had burned down to their last inch. Frank Osei was the last to go. He had stayed to help carry the serving dishes to the kitchen, which I had not asked him to do, but did not refuse. At the door, he put on his jacket and turned to me. He did not say anything about Serena or the deed or the way the room had gone silent when I set it on the table. He just put out his hand. I shook it. He said, "Evelyn would be proud." I said, "I know." That was the only thing I said about her that night. Frank nodded once, stepped off the porch, and walked down the driveway to his car. I watched his taillights until they turned at the corner. Then I went back inside and finished clearing the table. Serena was still in the dining room. She was standing at the far end near the window, her back to me, her arms crossed. She had not left with the guests. I did not know if that was courage or something else. Marcus came in from the hallway. He had his jacket on. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at her. Then he said, "I defended you to him for 3 years. Every time he had a question, I told him he was overthinking it." Serena turned around. She said his name. "I'm going to stay at the Oaks tonight," he said. "We can talk when I've had some time to think." He looked at me briefly, not asking permission, not apologizing, just acknowledging that I was there, that I had heard, and that he had made a choice he intended to stand behind. Then he walked to the front door and let himself out. I heard his car start in the driveway. I heard it pull away. Serena stood at the window for a long moment. Then she picked up her coat from the back of a chair and left without speaking to me. I did not watch her go. The deed was still on the table at the far end. I picked it up, slid it back into the envelope Arthur had prepared, and set it on the counter next to the dish rack. I washed the plates. I dried them. I put them away in the cabinet above the stove. The same cabinet Evelyn had chosen when we remodeled the kitchen in 1997. She had wanted the plates close to the stove because she said it made no sense to carry them across the room when you were already standing there cooking. She was right. She usually was. I turned off the lights at 11:15 and went to bed. I did not sleep for a long time, but that was not unusual. 8. Marcus came to the house 7 days later. He came alone, which told me something. He had called the night before to ask if he could stop by, and I had said yes without asking why, because I already knew why. He arrived at 10 in the morning. I had coffee ready. He sat down at the kitchen table, the same chair he had always used when he was a boy, the one closest to the window, the one with the slight wobble in the left rear leg that I had never fixed because he used to like rocking it back and forth when he was doing homework. I noticed he did not rock it now. He wrapped both hands around his coffee mug. He looked at the table for a moment, then at me. He said, "Dad, I didn't know she had done those things." I believed him. I had believed it before he said it, which made saying it harder, not easier. I told him that. I said, "I know you didn't. That's the hardest part." He looked up. He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "It would be simpler if you had known. Then I'd understand it. But you didn't know. And she was still your wife. And you trusted her because that's what you do when you love someone. I understand that too. That's what makes it hard." He was quiet for a while. Outside, a car passed on the street. The refrigerator made the low hum it always makes around 10 in the morning when the temperature in the house starts to rise. He said, "Can you forgive me?" I put my mug down. I looked at my son, this man who had sat in that chair for 30 years, who had his mother's eyes and my stubbornness, and who had, for a period of time, stopped being able to tell the difference between what someone told him was true and what was actually true. I thought about what I wanted to say, and then I said it. "You don't need forgiveness. You need a decision." He looked at me for a long time. I let him look. I had learned, over many years of reading surveys and site reports and structural assessments, that the most important information is usually in the thing that is not said. Marcus was not saying anything, and what he was not saying was that he already knew what the decision was. He just needed to be certain I was not going to make it for him. I did not make it for him. I refilled his coffee. We sat together for another hour, talking about other things about the gutters I needed to clean before November, about a project he had at work, about nothing in particular. When he left, he stood at the door for a moment and looked at the house the way people sometimes look at things they had stopped seeing clearly and have only just remembered. Then he said goodbye and walked to his car. I stood at the door until he was gone. Then I went back to the kitchen. 3 weeks after that, Marcus called Arthur Finch's office and confirmed that he and Serena would be vacating the property by the end of the month. He did not give Arthur a reason, and Arthur did not ask for one. Arthur called me that afternoon to confirm. He said simply, "No transfer requests are pending. Bright Key has closed their file. They had opened a preliminary listing under the Holt property address, but when Arthur notified them that no authorization from the primary owner existed, they closed it without further action. The property is yours, uncontested." I said, "Thank you, Arthur." He said, "That's what you pay me for." Marcus and Serena were living separately by then. He had not moved back to the house on Sycamore Court. I did not ask where he was staying, and he did not volunteer it. He was present, and he was working through something, and that was enough for now. Serena contacted Arthur twice after that, once by phone, once by email. Arthur did not respond to either. I did not ask what she had wanted to say. It did not matter. Diane told me, in the weeks that followed, that Marcus had been calling her every evening. She said he was not sleeping well. She said he told her that Serena had always explained things in a way that sounded reasonable, every decision, every step, every plan. He had trusted her explanations because they were always logical and because he had wanted to trust them. Diane said he kept using that phrase, "I wanted to believe her." She said it like she was not sure whether it was a confession or an explanation. Probably it was both. I listened to all of this. I did not offer an opinion. I knew what it was to want to believe something because the alternative was harder to hold. I had spent 6 months watching a woman dismantle something I had built over 4 decades. And for the first 2 of those months, I had told myself there must be an explanation I was missing. There was not. But I had needed the time to be certain. I understood Marcus. I did not say so. He did not need me to say so. He needed to work through it himself. And he was doing that. And the best thing I could do was stay where I had always been, at the same address, at the same phone number, available when he was ready. A letter arrived from Carol Pemberton on a Tuesday. It was handwritten on plain white paper, folded into thirds, with no return address on the envelope. I recognized her handwriting from the birthday card she had sent the previous year. The letter was short. There was no explanation of what she had known or not known, no accounting of her own role in the evening at the dinner table when she had sat beside her sister and said nothing. Just one sentence. "I'm sorry I didn't ask more questions." I folded the letter along its original creases and opened the top drawer of my desk, the narrow drawer on the left side, the one that sticks slightly in humid weather. I put the letter in there. The small notebook I had been keeping since April was already in that drawer. I had filled about 2/3 of it. Dates, observations, a few phone numbers, a note about the Bright Key Realty listing that Frank had found. Nothing dramatic, just a record of what I had seen, in the order I had seen it, in case I ever needed to remember the sequence clearly. I closed the drawer. 2 months after the dinner, I started repairing the crack in the corner of the kitchen window frame. It was a hairline fracture in the plaster surround, running diagonally from the upper left corner of the frame toward the wall about 4 inches long, slightly wider at the top than the bottom. I had known since 1989 what was causing it, a minor settlement in the foundation beneath that corner of the house. Nothing structurally significant, the kind of thing that happens to homes built on clay soil after enough freeze-thaw cycles. I had documented it in a site assessment I did myself the year after we moved in. I had never repaired it because Evelyn said it gave the house character. She said it made the kitchen look like it had been lived in by people who had actual lives, not just people who maintained things. I had agreed with her at the time. I still agreed with her, in the way you can agree with someone about something, and also know that things change. I bought the plaster compound on a Saturday morning. I spent about an hour cleaning the crack, widening it slightly with a tool so the compound would bond properly, and applying the first coat. Diane came by that afternoon and found me standing on the step stool with a putty knife. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at what I was doing. She said, "Mom would complain about that." I said, "I know." I pressed the compound into the upper section of the crack and drew the knife flat across it to level the surface. I kept working. Marcus and I had dinner together for the first time in 3 months on a Thursday evening in late November. He came alone. I made the same meal I had made for his birthday when he was 12, pot roast with carrots and potatoes. Nothing complicated, the kind of food that takes time but not skill. We sat at the kitchen table, just the two of us. No wine, no candles. The overhead light was on. It was an ordinary Thursday. Near the end of the meal, Marcus set down his fork and looked at me. He said, "Do you regret it?" I set down my own fork. I thought about the question honestly, the way I try to think about questions that deserve honest answers. I thought about the 6 months of watching and waiting. I thought about the dinner table and the 20 people and the deed in the envelope that Arthur had prepared and the moment I had walked to the far end of the table and placed it in front of Serena without saying a word. I thought about whether I wished any part of it had gone differently. I said, "No, but I wish I hadn't needed to do it." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded, once, slowly the way he nods when he is not agreeing with something so much as accepting it. He picked up his fork. I picked up mine. We finished the meal. After he left, I washed the dishes. 1 pot, 2 plates, 2 sets of silverware, 2 glasses. I have been washing dishes alone for 6 years now, and I have stopped noticing it the way I once did. It is simply what happens after dinner. I washed the pot first, then the plates, then the glasses, Then the silverware. I dried everything and put it away. The kitchen window was dark by then. I turned off the faucet and stood at the sink. Outside, in the side yard, the apple tree Evelyn planted in 1993 was flowering small white clusters, pale against the dark, the way it flowers every November when the weather stays mild a little longer than it should. She had chosen that spot because it got the afternoon light. She had been right about that too. I stood there for a while, looking at it. Then I turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. If you've ever had to let the facts speak for themselves, not because you had nothing to say, but because some things are finally, quietly settled, you already understand why he stood at that window a little longer than he needed to. If stories like this one find you at the right moment, subscribe, and I'll keep telling them.